The ground trembles. It's not an earthquake. It's the sound of a 100 zeros. 0 Persians advancing on the last Greek defensive line. 100 cavalry and infantry sent by a god king to erase Greece from the map. Facing them, a red line 10-0 Spartans alone. The rest of the Greek army is miles away in disarray, fleeing. This is not a battle. It's suicide. It's the nightmare of Thermopylae repeating itself in open field. This time there is no narrow pass, no rock walls to protect the flanks. It's a flooded plain, and the Persian commander Mardonius knows it. He's about to avenge his king's only naval defeat. He is savoring the annihilation of Sparta. How did it come to this? How 1 year after 300 men shook the greatest empire in the world, does the fate of the West once again depend on a handful of Spartans? To understand this impending massacre, we must go back to the smell of ash. 1 year had passed since the known world froze. 1 year since 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas, were annihilated in a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae, a suicidal defense. 300 against an army so vast they said it darkened the sun with its arrows. A glorious defeat, yes, but still a defeat. The Persian king Xerxes did not stop. He marched south and burned Athens to the ground. The Acropolis, the pride of Greece, reduced to ashes and rubble. Greece was broken on its knees, and then the question echoed in every city, every terrified home: what was the point of Leonidas' sacrifice? What was the point of the blood of the 300 if the result was total destruction? We think we know this story. We've been told the legend of the 300 1,000 times, but that's not the full story. It's just the prologue. A prologue to a much darker, much tenser thriller. The real story is not how 300 men died. It's how 10-0 Spartans avenged their deaths, and in the process saved the Western world. But this vengeance, this moment of brutal retribution, almost never happened because Sparta, the most feared war machine in Greece, hesitated. While Athens burned, the Spartans were building a wall, a literal wall, across the isthmus of Corinth. They were sealing themselves in their Peloponnese peninsula, debating whether saving the rest of Greece was worth the blood of their own sons. The logic was cold. Let the Persians drown trying to cross the sea to reach them. The man who held the fate of civilization in his hands was not a heroic king like Leonidas. He was a regent, a man living in the shadow of a ghost. His name was Paeanias, nephew of Leonidas, commander and chief of the Spartan army. And he was paralyzed. He had to march north. He had to risk every Spartan citizen, his entire army, an open field battle against an enemy that were die Spartaner. Outnumbered them 3-1, perhaps 5-1, or he had to secure Sparta and let the rest of the world burn. On the other side of the board was the Persian general Mardonius, cunning, arrogant, relentless. Xerxes had returned to Persia, but he left Mardonius with 300 elite men in one simple order: crush Greek resistance. And Mardonius didn't just use brute force. He was playing a deadly game of manipulation. He saw the division, saw the Spartan doubt, and sent messengers not to Sparta, but to the ruins of Athens. The deal he offered was tempting. Abandon those cowardly Spartans. He said, "Join me. I'll spare your lives. I'll rebuild your city with Persian gold. You'll be my most prized allies." Imagine the Athenian situation. Their city, a pile of smoking rocks. Their families, refugees on an island. Their Spartan allies hiding behind a wall. The temptation to accept to survive was immense. What would they do? Would they trust the Spartans who had visibly abandoned them in their darkest hour? The Athenian response would change the course of history. They sent a message not to Mardonius. They sent an ultimatum to Sparta, and the message was clear. If you do not march north now, if you do not come and face the Persian with us, then we will accept Mardonius's offer, not out of betrayal, but out of pure survival. And when we do, our ships and our armies will join his, and together we will come to Sparta and erase it from the map." Suddenly, Pausanias was not just facing a foreign invasion. He was facing total civil war. The time for politics, for doubt, for half-measures was over. Legend says a desperate and furious Athenian delegate stood before Pausanias and the Spartan elders. "The wall you're building," he shouted. "Is it to protect you from the Persians or to hide from shame? Leonidas died so you could live as cowards." That night, the decision was made. But Sparta does not move like other cities. There were no public announcements, no heroic speeches. It was done in secret. While the Athenian ambassadors slept frustrated and without an answer, Pausanias was already moving. Orders had been given: Fucua Spartiat Plitus, the elite citizen warriors, Fucin Perioi, the Lacedaemonian allies, and reportedly more than 30 Tohots, the serfs armed for war. The largest army Sparta had ever assembled marched in absolute silence under cover of darkness. The next morning, when the Athenians came to protest one last time before surrendering to Persia, a Spartan magistrate finally gave them the truth. "Our men," he said calmly, "are already on the way. In fact, they're probably miles from here by now, marching to face Mardonius." The game had changed. The deadliest war machine of the ancient world had been activated, and now nothing would stop it. 10-0 Spartan hoplites. The steel corps of a united Greek army marched toward a plain near a small town called Plataea. They marched not just to save Athens. They marched to avenge Leonidas. Mardonius learned of the Spartan march, and against all odds smiled. The game of diplomacy was over. Now began the game he knew best: total war. His plan to divide the Greeks had failed. But his plan to annihilate them was about to begin. He did not flee, did not retreat. On the contrary, he advanced. He chose the ground with a surgeon's precision. He knew the Spartans were masters of close combat, invincible in hills and narrow passes. So he chose the opposite. He chose the wide plain of Plataea in Bohea, a perfect killing field for his greatest advantage, cavalry. And he set his trap. He built a huge wooden stockade, a fortified camp on the banks of the Asopus River, a place from which his archers and riders could operate with impunity. Then he deployed his plan on der Reich. Strategy unvorberate ang army 300 zeros. 0 souls, Persians, Mess, Bactrians, Indians, and even Greeks. Greeks from Thebes who had chosen the invaders' side, convinced Persian victory was inevitable. When Pausanias arrived, his heart must have frozen. Across the river stretched a sea of tents, an ocean of men outnumbering his army 3-1. His 10-0 Spartans were the steel core, but the total Greek army with Athenians, Corinthians, and others barely reached 100,000 men, and they were in the worst possible place. Pausanias saw the trap immediately. If he ordered his hoplites to cross the river and charge, Persian cavalry would shred them horses, trampling their ranks, mounted archers, riddling them from afar. It would be a massacre. It would be Thermopylae on a scale 100 times larger. So he did the only thing he could. He waited. He ordered his men to camp on the slopes of the hills, bordering the plain just out of cavalry range. And so began the most tense standoff of antiquity. It was not a battle. It was a war of nerves, two massive armies a few kilometers apart, staring each other down. Every dawn, the sun rose over the two camps, and neither moved. 1 day, 2 days, 5 days a week, the tension was unbearable. Greek soldiers far from their farms watched their supplies dwindle. The heat was stifling. The stench of a 100 men camped in one place was overwhelming. And every day across the river they saw the Persian cavalry. Mardonius was not waiting, he was provoking. He sent his elite cavalry led by a man named Mystius, a legendary commander, a giant on a Nissan stallion with golden bridles. His mission was not to win a battle, but to break Greek morale. Day after day, Mestius and his riders galloped to the edge of the Greek lines, shooting arrows, shouting insults, calling the Spartans cowards. "There they are," they shouted, "the brave Spartans hiding in the hills like frightened goats. Where is your dead king now?" Perinius clenched his teeth and ordered his men to hold position. He knew one false move, one hoplite unit breaking ranks to chase the riders, would be annihilated. But provocation was not enough for Mardonius. He wanted blood. On the 8th day of the stalemate, he die Armee von 10. 0. Arrow 0 Kriegern ordered Mestius to attack for real. The Persian cavalry charged not against the entrenched Spartans on the heights, but against the Athenians holding the lower, more exposed ground. The charge was brutal. Thousands of riders crashed into the Athenian lines. The Greeks formed their shield wall, but horses slammed into them. Riders hurled javelins from above, archers fired volleys of arrows. The Athenians were being slaughtered, unable to strike back. They were about to break. If that line fell, the entire Greek army would collapse. Pausanias knew it. The Spartans knew it. Leonidas's vengeance was about to die in a cavalry skirmish before the real battle had even begun. Panic spread through the Athenian line. Men fell, shields splintered. They could not hold formation. They sent a desperate messenger to Pausanias, a runner who dodged horses and arrows. "We're broken," he shouted. "If you don't send help, we perish. The line won't hold." Pausanias, from his elevated position, watched the unfolding disaster. He turned to his Spartans. They were ready, eager for battle, but he could not move his main force. If he did, countryside into Entrillus Ennex, PL Pla of nothing, ANE, would open to Mardonius. In that moment of total doubt, as vengeance died before it was born, a small contingent of Megarian hoplites, seeing the Athenian collapse, made a suicidal decision. Just 300 men, they charged downhill into the chaos. It was not a disciplined charge. It was a desperate dash toward death, screaming their war cries. The Persian cavalry, surprised by this flank attack, wheeled to face them, and then the miracle happened. A random arrow fired from the Megarian or Athenian formation found its mark. Mestius's magnificent warrior reared in pain and threw the Persian giant to the ground. Suddenly, the god of war was in the mud. His scale armor of gold made him nearly invulnerable to spears, but also incredibly heavy. Before he could rise, Greek hoplites swarmed him. What followed was not a battle, it was a frenzy. Greeks piled on, stabbing at armor slits, hammering his helmet. Finally, an Athenian soldier, seeing they could not pierce his cuirass, drove a spear through the visor of his helmet straight into his eye. The great Mestius, terror of the Persian cavalry, was dead. When the Persians saw their leader, for fury overtook discipline, they ceased to be an army and became a mob, not to attack the Greeks, but to recover their commander's body. And so around one man's corpse erupted a pitched battle, a whirlwind of daggers, swords, and shields. Men stabbing each other in the face, in the stomach, fighting bare, handed for a piece of golden armor. The Greeks pushed, the Persians pulled. The body was dragged back and forth in bloody mud. Finally, the heavier, better armed hoplites secured the corpse. They formed a shield wall around it and slowly began retreating uphill, carrying their trophy. The Persian cavalry, defeated, leaderless, and humiliated, withdrew. That night the Greek army celebrated. They stripped Mestius's body. He was a man of impressive stature and beauty. They placed his corpse on a cart and paraded it slowly before all the Greek ranks. Men shouted, clashed spears against shields. It was the first victory, a small one, but with immense psychological impact. They had killed one of Mardonius's best, with Tude the cavalry, and had proof. In the Persian camp, the mood was the opposite. Mardonius was furious. he had lost his best cavalry commander to pure arrogance. It is said the cries and laments for Mestius's death echoed across the Bayan plain. The stalemate was broken, but not in Mardonius's favor. The Persian general realized provocations would not work. The Greeks would not leave their hills voluntarily. He would have to force them down. If he could not beat them with force, he would beat them with hunger and thirst. His strategy shifted. The war of nerves became a siege. He ordered his riders to stop attacking the front lines. Instead, he sent them in wide sweeps day and night to encircle the hills. Their target, the Greek army's throat, its supply lines. Hundreds of wagons loaded with grain and wine from the Pelpine were intercepted and burned. Convoys were massacred. Greek soldiers on the hills began to feel the first pangs of hunger. But Mardonius had an even more crucial target. The only freshwater source for the 100,000-man Greek army was not the Asaris River controlled by the Persians. It was a single spring in the hills, Garja Spring, a small oasis keeping an entire army alive, and now all Persian cavalry knew where it was. Mardonius gave the order, no more attacks, no more skirmishes. Pollute the water, he commanded, destroy the spring. The harassment began. Mounted archers galloped to the spring, firing volleys at any soldier trying to fill a water skin. Every trip for water became a suicide mission. The Greeks had to send armed hoplite squads just to protect the water carriers. The Greek army was dying of thirst within sight of a river. Morale so high after Mestius's death plummeted. Men were hungry, thirsty, and the stench of their own camp was becoming unbearable. Pausanias was in a Angrif off Thermopylae, tactic im detail death trap. He knew he could not stay, but he could not attack either, and now, thanks to Mardonius, he could not retreat. He was stuck in his own hill fortress. Time was running out. Thirst and hunger would kill his army before the Persians needed to raise a single sword. Vengeance for Thermopylae was about to drown in a muddy spring. Night fell on a dying army. Hunger gnawed stomachs. Thirst cracked lips. Greek commanders gathered in Pausanias's tent. Torchlight flickered, casting shadows on gaunt, desperate faces. The smell of defeat was palpable. Pausanias, Sparta's regent, the man bearing the weight of Leonidas's vengeance, had to make the most humiliating decision of his life. "We cannot stay," he said in a rasping voice, "and we cannot attack. We will withdraw." Withdraw. For a Spartan, the word was poison. It meant failure, cowardice, spitting on the grave of the 300 who chose to die rather than take one step back. The plan was desperate and nightmare military maneuver, moving over a 100,000 men in pitch darkness across rough terrain with enemy cavalry only kill 'em away. The goal was a position called the Island, a patch of land closer to Plataea, protected by 2 rivers. There they would find water. There they could regroup if they survived the night. Orders were whispered. At midnight, the army would move, and then hell broke loose. This was not one army. It was a coalition of mutually hating city-states united only by fear. And in the darkness, that coalition disintegrated. The center of the line, Corinthians and Nagarans obeyed. Terrified of cavalry, they grabbed their gear and fled toward Plataea, too fast, waiting for no one. They vanished into the night. On the left flank, the Athenians, always suspicious of Spartans, refused to move until sure the Spartans were moving too. They stood still, waiting as the plan unraveled, but the real drama unfolded on the right flank in the heart of the Spartan camp. A Spartier captain named Ammompharetus planted himself before Pausanias. His face was a mask of fury and shame. He refused to move. Spartan law forbids retreat. He growled, "Leonidas died. We stay and die. We do not flee like dogs." Pausanias was livid. A mutiny now in the darkest hour. He tried to reason. This is not retreat. It's a tactical reaction, in der Feind und das Schlachtfeld maneuver. We will die here if we do not move. Amatus simply picked up a large rock from the ground and dropped it at Paneus's feet. This is my vote, he said. I vote to stay in this place and fight. Time was slipping away, dawn was near. Paneus was trapped. He could not abandon a Spartan unit to be massacred, but he could not stay and condemn the entire army to die of thirst. Paneus's patience snapped. He made a brutal decision. Let him stay, he ordered the rest of his army. We march, if he has honor, he will follow. And so the mighty Spartan phalanx, Greece's main force, began to withdraw, leaving one of its own captains and his unit alone against 300 enemies. Dawn of the 12th day broke over the Plataea plain. Mardonius's scouts looked toward the hills where the Greek army had camped for nearly 2 weeks, and saw nothing. The hills were empty, the Greek camp had vanished, the news spread like wildfire to Mardonius's tent. The Persian general emerged, squinting into the rising sun, and then in the distance he saw chaos. He did not see a united army. He saw scattered groups of men in disorder. He saw the Athenians on his left flank, marching confusedly toward the hills. He saw the Spartans in the center, withdrawing slowly across the plain, trying to reach the foothills. Mardonius laughed. Cowards, he roared. Look at them, the Spartans fleeing. He saw Ferretus' unit, which had finally decided to move and was running to catch the main army. He saw historisch Quellen, Warite Oder legend, confusion, not a tactical maneuver. He saw desperate flight. Arrogance, the fatal error that killed Mystius, now infected the commander-in-chief himself. He turned to his generals. They have fasted for days. They are thirsty, and now they run. We need no strategy. Just catch them. He mounted his white warhorse, drew his scimitar, attack. He shouted, full force, no quarter. Today is Greece's last day. The 10-0 immortals, the king's personal guard, charged first. Behind them, the Persian cavalry, and behind them, the roar of 300 men, smelling blood, surged in a massive human wave across the Asopus River, straight toward the fleeing Spartans. Mardonius's trap had not worked, but Pausanias's failed withdrawal had handed him victory on a silver platter. The ground trembled. It was not a metaphor. It was 100 ft and tens of thousands of hooves pounding the earth in unison. Pausanias turned, and his blood froze. The withdrawal was over. The plain across the river was alive. Mardonius's army was not advancing. It was pouring across the ground like a black flood, roaring a deafening cry coming straight for them. First the cavalry, the nightmare of every hoplite. Persian riders forded the river without hesitation and thundered into gallop. They did not attempt a frontal charge against a phalanx. There was no phalanx, only a swarm of men running. Formation. Pausanias shouted, form the line. The Spartans, disciplined even on the brink of annihilation, tried to turn and plant their shields, but it was too late. The first wave was not spears, it was arrows, thousands, tens of thousands. Persian, mounted archers galloped in perfect circles around the Spartan mass, shooting black clouds of death. Men screamed, fell with arrows in throats and unprotected legs between armor joints. It was slaughter at range. The Spartans could do nothing. They were being bled dry, annihilated in the open, exactly as Mardonius had planned. And then, behind the cavalry, came the infantry. The immortals, Persian elite, marched with terrifying arrogance. They reached shooting range and loosed their own arrows. The air darkened. Pausanias desperately sought help. "Where are the Athenians, my lord?" a scout shouted. "The Athenians are engaged. Thebes have intercepted them." The Greek army was split in two. The treachery of the Thebans Greeks, fighting for Persia, had worked. The Athenians were locked in their own network dungeon. Das Vermächtnis der Spartaner survival battle on the left flank completely isolated. No one was coming to help the Spartans. They were alone. Persian infantry was now 100 m away, then 50. They were close. The Spartans could see the whites of their eyes, and the Spartans did not move. Amid the rain of arrows, chaos, and shouting, Pausanias ordered his men to halt. Men were dying around him, but he stared at the army priest. The sacrifice Pausanias shouted. Now Spartan law was absolute, no battle without favorable omens. The trembling priest slit a sheep's throat on the blood-stained ground. Men fell dead atop him as he read the entrails. Pausanias seized him. Well, the priest looked up, eyes full of terror, unfavorable. An arrow struck Pausanias's shield so hard it nearly broke his arm. Sacrifice another, he roared. The priest sacrificed another animal. Persians were 30 m away. They no longer shot arrows. They readied short spears, unfavorable. The priest shouted again. Spartan captains looked at Pausanias. Their men were being massacred without striking a blow. Discipline was turning into suicide. Vengeance for Leonidas was dying in a ritual of blood and mud. The first Persian elite guard, the Immortals, crashed into the Spartan shields. The battle had begun, and the Spartans did not even have permission to fight. They could only defend. Pausanias, in agony of desperation, no longer looked at the priest. He turned, raised his arms to the sky towards where he believed Hera's temple stood, and shouted, "Gods, do not abandon us now. Do not let Greece die here." In the exact instant, the first Persian line began to push. The priest, after a third sacrifice, shouted, "The omens are favorable." It was as if lightning struck Pausanias. The regent lowered his arms. His face was no longer that of a politician or general. It was a mask of pure fury. He turned to his men, waiting for the order as they died. Sparta! The cry was not an order, it was an explosion. The Spartan phalanx, the most perfect killing machine ever conceived, finally activated. They lowered their spears, and the shield wall that had been retreating and defending suddenly, as one organism, advanced. The cry was release. A year of humiliation contained rage, shame over a dead king in a mountain pass. All that poison, all that Spartan discipline channeled into one movement. The advance was not a disordered charge. It was something far more terrifying. It was the movement of a glacier made of bronze and steel, militarily united shield to shield. The 10-0. 0-0 Spartans took one step, then another. The Persian Immortals. The empire's elite stopped at Thermopylae, only by terrain, now faced the Spartan phalanx in open field. And for a second, the universe paused, then they collided. The sound was not swords, it was dull thunder. The crash of thousands of bronze shields against wicker shields, and the wicker shields disintegrated. It was a tragic joke. The Persians, brave, proud, were armed for a different war. Their light shields designed to stop arrows shattered. Their quilted linen armor useless. Spartan spears were longer, nearly 3 m. Persians could not even touch a Spartan before their bodies were pierced, not once, but 2, 3 times by rear ranks thrusting through gaps. It was not a battle. It instantly became a meat grinder. The first Persian rank was impaled. The second, stumbling over the first's corpses, was impaled. Mardonius's massive numbers, his greatest advantage, became his worst nightmare. Men in the rear, unable to see the horror, pushed their own comrades into the Spartan grinder. The Spartans did not shout no wasted fury, just the rhythmic work of death push shield. Bracefoot thrust, spear recover, spear repeat. Mardonius from his white warhorse watched his arrogance evaporated, replaced by icy horror. He had seen these men flee, ordered their annihilation, and now they were erasing his immortal guard from the map. He knew the battle had come down to this precise instant. If that bronze line advanced, his entire demoralized army, without its allies, Leonidas Thermopylae leader, would collapse. He had to break the fangs. He had to do it himself. He turned to his personal guard, 1,000 of the empire's best riders and nobles. "With me," he shouted, "for the king." He drew his scimitar and spurred his horse not to the flank, not the rear. He charged headlong into the center of the Spartan line. The man who burned Athens, who defiled Greece, now led a suicidal charge into the heart of the beast. The charge of the 1,000 nobles was apocalyptic. They crashed into the shield wall, armored war horses, desperate, brave men. For a moment, the Spartan line bent, spears snapped, men fell crushed under hooves. Mardonius was a storm at the battle's center. He towered over the infantry, his horse rearing, scimitar flashing as he slashed shattering helmets, severing limbs. He shouted, seeking Pausanias, believing if he killed the king, he would win the war. And then a Spartan named Leonidas, a man history almost forgets, saw the giant on the white horse. He had no spear long enough. He was being pushed back. He saw Mardonius raise his sword to kill another brother. Armistice did not think he acted. He ducked amid the infernal chaos, and with both hands seized the thing that had defined this land for a year. A rock. With all his body's strength, he hurled the stone. It flew through the air, a simple rock against a war god, and struck Mardonius square in the head. Historians would say neck or eye, but the result was the same. The Persian general reeled. His sword fell from his hand. He sat motionless in the saddle for a second, eyes staring at nothing. And then the conqueror of Athens slumped from his horse and fell Helden, mut und strategisch inchade, engine like a sack into Placia's bloody mud. A 1-second silence spread around the body, and then the entire Persian army saw it. Their leader, their general, there will lay dead on the ground. Leonidas's vengeance was not finished. It had just found its target. Panic has a sound. It is a collective choked scream, a whisper becoming a roar. For the Persian army, it was the sound of 300 hearts breaking at once. The man in the mud was not just a general. He was the king of kings' representative, the empire's will, and he was dead. The immortals, Mardonius's personal guard, fighting with suicidal fury against the phalanx, stopped. They saw the riderless white horse, saw the crushed body, and for the first time in their lives felt fear. One turned, then 2, then 100. In under 30 seconds, the most feared fighting force in the Persian Empire broke ranks. They turned and ran, and that single act of panic became the death sentence for the entire army. The wave of 300 men that had advanced so arrogantly now retreated. But like a stampede, men trampling men infantry, overrun by their own terrified cavalry, the Persian army collapsed upon itself. Pausanias' face caked in blood and dust watched the chaos. The enemy line had evaporated. The Spartans saw it too. And the iron discipline that had kept them in formation, the same discipline that made them wait for the gods' permission while dying, now channeled into a new purpose. No longer defense extermination. Run was the only order. The shield war dissolved, and 10-0 Spartans, alpha predators of the ancient world, were unleashed. They dropped heavy phalanx spears, drew Zio short swords designed not for dueling but for stabbing in chaos. And the hunt began. For a year they had carried Thermopylae as a brand of shame. Leonidas' sacrifice had been in vain while Athens burned. Now payment had come. Every Spartan ran, and with every stride they shouted their dead king's name, Leonidas. Leonidas, the plain of Plataea, became an open-air slaughterhouse. Persians in light armor were fast, but panic made them stupid. The methodical Spartans did not chase the fastest. They felled the Zeusimen, Vishung der Schlacht slow, the stumbling. They aimed for hamstrings' backs. It was dirty, efficient work. The Asopus River they had crossed so confidently that morning became a deadly barrier. Thousands drowned, pushed into the water by the press from behind, only to be stabbed in the back by arriving Spartans. The river ran red with Persian blood for the second time in a year, but most of the terrified army did not run to the mountains. They ran to the only place they thought safe, their camp, the huge wooden fortress Mardonius had built. They reached the gates, a maddened human mass pushing, crushing each other to get in. Persian archers on the wooden watchtowers shot arrows not at approaching Spartans, but at their own men to clear space at the gate. Finally, they closed the massive wooden gates. Silence fell. Inside the fortress 100,000, perhaps 200,000 Persian survivors panted in terror, but alive they were safe. And then through the silence they heard footsteps. The Greek army reached the wooden walls. Pallanius halted his men. They were hoplites, the world's best heavy infantry, but not siege engineers. Their spears and short swords were useless against walls meters high. Spartans began hammering the wood with swords in frustration. Persians on the battlements began shooting arrows again, now confident behind defenses. Vengeance had stopped at a wooden wall. The Spartans had won the battle, but the Persian army had survived. They were trapped, and then from the left flank Pausanias heard cheers. It was the Athenians. They had spent the morning in their own brutal private war against the traitor Theans. One now, covered in bedewed tongue-four digesked Greek and Persian blood, they reached the fortress. And the Athenians, unlike the Spartans, were not just soldiers. They were sailors, builders, Greece's most sophisticated engineers. An Athenian captain looked at the wooden wall, saw Spartans beating it uselessly, and smiled. He turned to his men. "Bring the axes." The final gate of hell was about to open. The sound of axes is different from swords. It is more personal, more methodical. Persians on the battlements heard the dull thud of wood on wood again and again. It was the Athenians, and they knew time was up. It was not a gate, it was their tomb, and the Greeks were hacking it open. Persian archers fired frantically from above. Men fell with arrows in necks, eyes, but for every Athenian who fell, another took his axe and kept swinging. Wood groaned, hinges moaned, Spartans waited. They stood formed just behind the Athenians in a silence more terrifying than any war cry. Their short swords, still dripping plain blood, were drawn, their eyes fixed on the splintering gate. There was no rage on their faces, only terrifying focus. They were surgeons of death waiting for the operating room to open. Then with a crack that seemed to tear the sky, the gate gave, first a slit, then the great wooden beam split and collapsed inward. For a second, absolute silence. Wood dust hung in the air. Inside the camp, the Greeks could see a sea of pale, terrified Persian faces, paralyzed. Pausanias did not shout an order. He simply raised his sword. The first Spartan threw was Aramstus, the man who killed Mardonius with a stone. He crossed the threshold, and his short sword found flesh, and then hell swallowed the Persian camp. The 10,000 Spartans poured through the breach not in phalanx, but like a wolf pack in a sheep pen. The camp was a maze of tense wagons, terrified horses. There was nowhere to form a line, nowhere to flee. For the Persians, it was the worst possible nightmare. They were trapped shoulder to shoulder with the planet's most efficient killers. It became thousands of individual duels. One Spartan against 3 Persians. One Spartan stabbing a man spinning to block another, gutting the third all in under 3 seconds. Persians fought. They fought with the desperation of cornered rats. They used dagger stools, tent poles, but Spartans were a different level of violence. Their round shields were weapons. They smashed faces with them. Their short swords were pistons designed to stab upward under ribs into groin armpits. Blood did not flow. It coated the camp floor so fast men slipped in it. Screams were deafening. The Athenians entered right after the Spartans. And where Spartans killed with icy efficiency, the Athenians killed with burning hatred. This was their vengeance for burned temples, for their ruined city. They chased Persians into their own tents, slashing canvas, toppling poles on them, then stabbing through the cloth as they writhed on the ground. The camp became a kilometer-wide slaughterhouse. Epilogue. Rake, Mutt and Dunkel Jeskicht Porsenius stood near the broken gate, watching the tide of his men consume everything ahead. He was no longer a general, he was a witness. He saw one group of Persians, perhaps 40, manage to break a section of wall on the far side of the camp. They fled north, led by a commander named Artabazus, who had kept his men out of the initial battle. Sensing disaster, Panias let them go. They were irrelevant. The serpent's head was cut off. The body was being dismembered. The sun began to set. Dawn had seen a desperate withdrawal. Midday had seen the greatest battle in Greek history, and sunset now lit the end of Xerxes's army. The historian Herodotus would later say that of the 300 men Mardonius commanded, only the 40 who fled with Artabazus and scarcely 3 more survived that day. Hundreds of thousands annihilated. When darkness fell, the screams finally ceased. The silence that settled over Plataea was heavier than steel. The Spartans emerged from the camp. They no longer resembled the soldiers who entered. They were coated head to toe in a crimson and black varnish of blood and mud. Their arms were exhausted from killing. They walked in silence to their general's tent. Pausanias, the regent who had hesitated, the man who nearly lost the war through indecision, now stood at the center of the most absolute victory Greece had ever known. And then he ordered the final vengeance. Find Mardonius's body, he said. His voice was calm, almost empty. They found it where he fell on the plain. They stripped his scale armor, his jeweled scimitar. An advisor approached Pausanias. "My lord," he said, "now we must complete the vengeance. Just as Xerxes cut off our king Leonidas' head at the Thermopylae and impaled it on a stake, we must do the same to Mardonius." It was justice eye for eye. It was what everyone expected. Pausanias looked at the mangled body of the Persian general. Then he looked at his men, the 10 survivors who had avenged their 300 brothers. "No," Pausanias said. His answer shocked everyone. "That," he said, pointing at the mutilated corpse, "is behavior worthy of barbarians, not Spartans." They buried Mardonius with full military honors, due a brave commander, though an enemy. Vengeance was not a body on a stake. Vengeance was the silence in the Persian camp. Vengeance was the Red River. Vengeance was Greece's freedom bought that day forever. When news of Plataea reached Ionia across the Aegean, the Greek cities enslaved by Persia rose in rebellion. Xerxes's empire had not just lost an army. It had lost its aura of invincibility. It had all begun with 300 men who chose to die in a mountain pass. But it did not end there. It ended here on a muddy plain with 10 blood-covered Spartans finally deciding the best vengeance was not barbarism. It was total victory, music,